we'll drag the weights out to the circle, so they can step right out of the circle and do, if it's a clean, do a clean and, relax. Or, when I was coaching the girls up in Pinnetan, I had my throwing farm up there. They just jump on the quad, ride the quad up to the weight room, do a few sets and come back down and throw again. It's done right there. The whole thing. It's literally, you take 4 or 5 throws and run up to the weight room, do a few sets, do whatever's prescribed, come back down. It's all done right there. It doesn't have to be that way. You can change it up any way you want. It's the thing that's important, and I think this was in your example with Lauren, is that it's not about really so much about the specifics of what you're doing. It's the actual change that is what's important.
That was track and field coach and training organization expert Derek Evely speaking on the importance of training variation and how it can be used in the scope of complex training in getting the ultimate adaptation, especially for advanced athletes. You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Simpli Faster. Simpli Faster is an online athletic performance technology shop distributing items such as the Freelap timing system, GymAware, K-Box, 1080 Sprint, and the Speed Mat. I've gotten many of these items from Simpli Faster and can confidently say that they make today's best training technology available to everybody. The Freelap timing system has revolutionized both my practices and my athlete assessments, allowing me to look at the 10-meter fly capability of dozens of athletes in a matter of seconds. It is wireless, compact, portable, and incredibly versatile. The K-Box and 1080 Sprint are fantastic tools for any coach looking to build speed, agility, and implement training scenarios that go beyond the traditional weight room. The 1080 Sprint is being used by great coaches training some of the fastest sprinters in the world, and it truly represents high-performance speed training. I can personally attest that Simpli Faster's customer service is second to none. Christopher at Simpli Faster responds quickly to queries, and anyone who makes a purchase from Simpli Faster is in good hands. If you want to acquire some of the best high-tech training equipment available, stop by simplifaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. They are the future of coaching technology. Hello and welcome to episode 102 of the Just Fly Performance Podcast. We have back on the line Derek Evely. He is a training organization expert, well-versed in the Bondarchuk training system. As a track and field coach, he has trained all types of athletes, not just throwers, to a very high level. And if you ask great coaches, who in the world is one of the best, if not the best, in terms of training organization, putting parts of training together, tracking adaptation, getting athletes to hit their highest marks and peak at the right time, Derek Evely is a name you are going to hear a lot, and for a good reason. In terms of training, planning, organization, he is the man. I love talking to the guy. He was originally appeared back on episode 43. He is back on again, and we're back with another great lineup of questions. Last time, Derek spoke on the core principles of the Bondarchuk training system and how the ideas can be applied very specifically, like kind of porting some things over into sprint training and speed training. The Bondarchuk training system was used or invented by Anatoliy Bondarchuk, was used in the 80s and 90s, particularly to yield very consistent Olympic medal sweeps in the hammer throw, and was historic in its dominance and how those athletes became so good. If you did not get a chance to catch episode 43, which if you haven't heard about the system, 43 is a good place to go. Hammer Media also has some great podcasts with Derek speaking on the Bondarchuk training system, but I'll just give you a very quick overview of it again, just for if you're listening to the podcast and you don't know what the system is, you may get a little bit lost. So I'll clarify some things for reference sake. And at its essence, it's doing one or maybe two workouts, and I believe Derek might even incorporate 3 in some cases. But let's just say, to keep it simple, doing the same exact workout every day, and that workout is going to be composed of 4 basic parts. The first is the competitive exercise, which is the specific event you're doing. So if it's shot put, it's throwing a shot put, maybe the same weight as competition, maybe a little under, maybe a little over. A special strength exercise, so something that would mimic your main exercise. So in shot put, maybe it's a sandbag throw that mimics all the same joint motions. It's just with you're throwing something a little bit different. Then you have a special preparatory exercise, which is generally a strength movement that uses the same prime muscles as your event. So for shot put, maybe we're talking a push jerk, clean, a lot of stuff that's in the weight room would go here. And then basic general triplanar exercises. So basic circuit exercises such as rotational movements and core and abdominal movements in the weight room, low back movements, those types of things. So those 4 elements are going to be in every workout. They're in a small enough volume that you're not going to blow the circuits, and you're doing that every day. And then you're tracking the adaptation by looking at what the distance of that main throw was, that shot put throw. And basically when you tap out, so after you do enough sessions and your shot put performance increases, eventually it will start to come back down after reaching a peak, at which point you have reached your adaptation. And then you will go through a rest period and then go through a new cycle, changing all the exercises. And that means you get the overload through the variation. Every time I do a little summary before I bring a world expert on, I always get a little bit nervous about doing that. I want to make sure I got it right, but I do believe that's a good description. And the beauty of the system is it's very simple. You only have 1 or 2, maybe 3 workouts, and so it's easier to make a good guess as to what was influencing the performance, how it influenced the performance. The weights that you use generally, they don't change. So the system is very set up to be able to track and assess athletes' performance and adaptation curves. Whereas a traditional program, it might be a lot more difficult because the weights in the program are always changing and there's a lot more methods and means and those types of ideas. So that's the system in a nutshell. For today's podcast, again, last time we talked a little bit about the Bondarchuk system, how it can port over to things like speed training. Today we're going to go into ideas that revolve a little bit more about Derek's thoughts and ideas on common periodization. Common periodization means like delayed transformation, so doing like a heavy strength training block and then working speed after that block. We're going to talk about the role of variation in producing overload, which you heard a little bit about in the intro. So, and which is just massive, especially if you've been working with athletes for some time, more advanced athletes. You're getting into things like complex training and French contrast, and you're trying to figure out how to manage that variation over time. Derek's going to go into that. He's going to talk about how to create an optimal peaking cycle and gathering information from previous cycles. And also he's going to get into an awesome talk on the part system or complex training and how that can be used, especially in advanced athletes with good training experience, to continue delivering that variation that they need so much into their system to get those gains. So let's get on to the podcast 102 with Derek Evely. Again, don't forget to check out the new course he has coming out regarding training organization and what he's learned from the Bondarchuk training system. Let's get to the show. Derek, welcome back to the show. Thanks for being here again.
Hey, it's good to be back.
Yeah, so I know you've been doing a little bit of traveling since last time. I think we were episode 60-something before. And so what's been new in the life of Derek Evely over the last year?
Well, last year I was in China for 7 months. I had a coaching contract there, and it went quite well, and it's pretty productive. But I'm trying to find ways to stay at home more. I got 3 kids, young age, and you're expecting one, right? As we speak, actually.
Yeah, I might get a text here from the wife.
So for those listening, I was getting emails going, we're going to do this Friday morning unless my wife drops a kid, right? So so it looks like she didn't drop it, so here we are. But I'm trying to find ways to spend more time at home, and also I've started a website. It's eviltracksport.com. It's not live yet, so if you search for that, you won't find it. And I'm going to be hosting courses on, various things. But what I'm launching it with a Bondarchuk course, and that should be up live at the beginning to mid-June somewhere. That's what I'm targeting right now. And so it's like I'm trying to find ways to, rather than do a lot of conference work and present this stuff. And which is really difficult when you're talking about Bondarchuk stuff, although I don't always present on that. In fact, I rarely kind of present on that. But that's really not the platform to sort of get the whole Bondarchuk system across, which has never been done before. And that's the other reason why I'm doing it, is because I mean, literally, I am getting 2 to 3 inquiries a week from people that want to know more about the system. And it's, it's like even Bondarchuk himself has never really explain to people how to actually, the nuts and bolts, how do you put this thing together? And trust me, you will not get it from reading the books. And so I just decided to bite the bullet. I've been meaning to do it for years now, and I just decided to bite the bullet and do an actual course on it. And so I'm in the process right now of writing all the content. It's mostly going to be videos with some written content. The book that him and I wrote, which a lot of people have probably, if you've heard me talk about it before, him and I wrote a book on his methodology years ago, but it never saw the light of day. So when we wrote it, it was very painstaking process of him writing everything down in Russian, translating it, and then the next morning me trying to decipher that. And we got frustrated after about 6 months of that. It's when he lived with me back in 2005. And then he went off on his own to write all the periodization books, those little blue and green colored, purple colored books. And so, but we never released that. Nobody ever saw that. So I'm using a lot of that. That'll be up there. Some of that is the framework for the course. And it's pretty crazy because once I started actually doing the course, there's a lot to it. So it's it's there. I'm probably going to have somewhere between 12 to 20 hours of video walking people through how to do Bondarchuk for any sport. And so that's what I've been consumed with lately. And yeah, so if anybody's interested in that, that's where you'll go. But like I said, it should be live early to mid-June. I will tweet it out when it's live. So yeah. So, and I'm doing this with Dr. B. You won't see him on it. There's reasons with his Russian or his Ukrainian publisher for that. He can't really be on the site, but I am consulting with him where I need to. It's not that much, but I do go over there every few days and we run through what I've done and to get the okay from him on it. So it's all and I'm pretty proud of the content. It looks pretty good at this point.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's always ever since I've become aware of the Bondarchuk philosophies and ideals is that gap a little bit between just kind of getting the general gist of it and then once you start to actually dig deep into the nuts and bolts and how it can apply to things. And so that sounds really cool. I think that'll really help out a lot of people and always transferring philosophies over across sports too. I know we talked a lot about that last podcast, but it sounds like a really cool opportunity there for you. And I'm definitely excited for that to hit the market.
Yeah, it's the biggest problem with the Bondarchuk thing, like I said, it's never, there's nowhere you can go to sort of get an explanation on it unless you talk to the athletes that have done it or myself or Bingus or someone like that. But the problem is that if you talk to the athletes about it, the system is so individualized that you get what their version is of it. And so I'm trying to get away from that and offer a comprehensive approach to, what is all the basic philosophy, the theory behind it. And then I do what Bondarchuk just does not do in his books is that give examples. Mm-hmm. So I'm constantly giving examples in it. This is what you do in this situation. And I think, this is the last thing I'll say about it and then we can move on. But I think that it's important to understand one of the big myths out there with the Bondarchuk system is that you have to give up whatever your a lot of your favorite things that are in your bag of tricks in terms of how you develop athletes, and you don't have to do that. What the Bondarchuk system really is, it's an overall system, how you put everything together. Yes, there's some rules you have to stick by, but you can actually, there's a ton of creativity. There's a ton of room for creativity in terms of developing your own, how you design programs and your workouts and things like that. The Bondarchuk system is really all about how you manage the cycles from one to another, and how you structure those cycles. So anyway, so hopefully it's going to fly, and it'll give people some insight. And I think you can, even if you don't do Bondarchuk, I talk a lot about this in the introduction, even if you're not going to implement the Bondarchuk stuff, there's some stuff in there that is, like, I think really important for coaches to understand. There's things that I've learned doing the system, giving me some insight into how athletes react to training, that I think every single coach should know. So.
Yeah, I think that is typically a lot of people would be like, oh man, I have to do like a similar workout, this often or something like that. And I want to do different stuff. But to me, it's more like being able to assess and track if what you did, how the reaction of what you did, and being able to quantify that, even if it's not, I think that's ultimately what I've, striven for. Is that a word, striven? I mean, that's what I'm always constantly striving for. And I think that system is just so good at helping athletes, or helping coaches figure that out. And I know with creativity too, you had mentioned, I think Bondarchuk was highly experimental and creative in his stuff, even within, a system that people might say it's not. And so that's interesting to me.
It's all he does is experiment, and I think, again, that's one of the reasons, his system with his athletes hasn't always worked out since he got to North America. And a lot of that is because he's playing around, he's experimenting with things all the time. And it's just, I go through all of that on the site. It's just very difficult to decipher with Bondarchuk, when you watch him doing what he's doing, what is an experiment and what is actual, but like I said, there's so much room for experimentation and doing your own thing within the system that, it can be misleading. But hopefully by the end of the course, when someone takes course, they understand all that. So,
yeah. Well, hey, let's dig into some nuts and bolts of some of the things that I think will, hopefully I'm sure are in the course, but just general topics and ideas on training athletes and ideas in Bondarchuk's system. But one of the things, Derek, you talked about last time that I thought was really cool, you mentioned that you thought athletes who had a very good maximal strength base and then switched to the Bondarchuk system, that combination seemed to work fairly well. Or very well for those athletes. And I was wondering if you could expand on your thoughts on maximal strength development in the role of throwers. Do you think like the idea of get really strong and then you would taper down once you are strong enough, or bringing maximal strength up very slowly over a period of time? What are some kind of digging into that thoughts in that realm? Because I know that's always hotly debated.
Well, I'm a big believer on a complex methodology. I go through that extensively in the course, where you can do a complex methodology. But what does complex really mean? Does that mean doing everything in the same season, in the same macro, in the same in the same microcycle, or even in the same session, right? Not all sports can do all 4 exercise classifications, can do all forms of work in the same session. So, first of all, we need to talk about, what is complex. Well, I believe that in every single micro, you need to be working on all 4 exercise classifications. Now, you can cycle the differences in those from what we call a PDSF, or what someone might call a macrocycle, a collection of microcycles that ends in a peak. You can shift the focus from one of those to the next. But I think in terms of throws, when we're talking about maximal strength, yeah, I mean, it always needs to be there. And this is one of the big myths with Bondarchuk, is that he's a non-believer in maximal strength or anything like that, which just simply isn't true. If you ask him, he'll tell you that there is a certain level of absolute strength or maximal strength. I know those aren't exactly the same, but for this sake of this conversation, let's just say it is. There's a certain level of that absolute strength that a thrower needs to be successful at any level, right? I mean, I think everybody can accept that. The problem is that we're not sure what those levels are. Nobody's really sure what those levels are, because the the only way to really examine it is to do a retro analysis, which Bondarchuk has done tons of. And so what happened with that is that he found that when he went back and he looked at all the different levels of throwing, say you're a javelin guy, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So say you take the javelin and you look at, okay, everybody between 55 and 60 is a zone, and 60 and 65, and you go all the way up to 90 and 100 meters or whatever. They tested all of these athletes, which is essentially asking for their PBs in questionnaires. And when you look at the results, it's like, yeah, I mean, everybody is over a certain level of maximal strength at certain levels. But the variance is kind of wild. Like when you look over, like say you look at javelin throwers over 80 meters, there's some are super strong and some are not so strong. So, that led him to this conclusion that, well, more maximal strength is not better. Does not necessarily mean, it's better. Which I agree with, but you need some, okay? I mean, so we can all agree that you need some. The problem is, and then the second question to that is how do you get it? Like how do you get there, right? So that, because that complicates everything. So we know that just doing ballistic type of exercises, whether even if it's throwing the javelin or the example we throw out there a lot is sprinting, that will increase your maximal strength. We know that. Will it increase it enough to that if you don't do any maximal strength or any, will that increase it enough to be a world-class thrower? Probably not. So you probably need some. But, to me, the issue really comes down to black and white thinking, right? Is people say, well, I'm either going to do lots of it or I'm not going to do any of it. And that's really not what it's about. It's about working the need for that level of strength within your program, within your system, doing it on a, regularly and consistently, and making sure that the way that you dose it fits in with your overall strategy in terms of periodization and cycle design and development. Okay. So again, it comes back to not doing huge blocks of strength and then unloading and doing huge blocks of specific work, right? I like to bring them all along at the same time. In the Bondarchuk system, when you're talking about throwers, especially heavy throwers, that takes a bit of finesse introducing that, because you are, we're lifting every day and throwing every day. So you can't go and slam them with huge volumes every day. Otherwise you're going to have a problem, right? So, yeah, I don't know if I gave you a straight answer there, but to me, I take a bit different approach than Dr. B does, in that if you go and look, for him, I think if he's made any mistakes in implementing his own system, especially when he was here in Kamloops, he probably let off on that a bit too much. And I think a few people probably paid the price for that, after 2 or 3 years. When we look at Dylan, Dylan I coached Dylan up until he was 24, 25 and threw about 20 meters, 1983. He actually had thrown over 20 meters in practice right before Dr. B got here, but Dylan was so grotesquely strong, that I think it carried him a long time. Right. And plus, and so he was able, his growth just continued with Dr. B. It worked out really well. But back to your original question, yeah, I think athletes that come from big strength backgrounds and then do the Bondarchuk system, I think they initially have a big jump off of that. But sooner or later, you're going to need to get back to it, or those levels are going to taper off, unless you are just retardedly strong like Dylan was. And it carried a bit longer for him. So I'm always trying to find ways to implement that max strength in there, do a bit of it, but not let it interfere, not do big blocks of it or develop it to the detriment of the the SDE and the CE, the specific development exercises and the competitive exercise.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, I think in unpacking a lot of the just the really insightful things, and that's very helpful to me, because I think like ultimately going into case studies and retrospective is a lot more valuable than a lot of the broad spectrum research studies, especially on physical education college students and stuff like that, like going into it. But I think one of the things that I'd like if you could expand here a little bit, but like I think the idea of I think a lot of what it could come down to is not, like you said, not letting the strike training interfere with the competitive exercise, which basically I think would take out that idea of having a strength block, like classic periodization, strength phase, max strength phase, power phase. I guess would it be safe to say that like that mentality, especially that, I know you see this a lot in like Verkhoshansky's work, that big strength block, like that big colored block, and then the line where they go way down and then they come way back up. I've had some problems with that, trying that out. I've always felt like just bringing everything up in tandem has always been more effective. Is it ever a good idea to have like a strength block or emphasis where that might be dragging down or temporarily inhibiting some speed abilities from like being realized or happening? Or is that, maybe I'm trying, do you get what I'm getting at? I'm trying to kind of
totally. And I go again, some shameless self-promotion here, but I go through that extensively in the course. So again, what's going to kill you here is black and white thinking. Okay, so yes, I prefer to develop those abilities, those strength abilities, simultaneously with the specific ones. But that doesn't mean that when you step back and you look at the Bondarchuk system and you go, okay, well, a typical thrower may have 5 to 6 peaks PDSFs in a given season, and that's what makes the system so different, right? Sprinters maybe 3 to 4 if you're lucky. Then there's other situations where other sports where you may not get that many, but you're trying to get as many as you can. But there's realities there, the way the sport's set up, whatever, right? The need for recovery between specific sessions and things like that. So, but that doesn't mean that if you look at those 5, say, let's, for example, say that you're a javelin guy and you're probably going to get 5 to 6 of these session or of these PDSFs, these cycles, which again is roughly equivalent to what you might call a meso or macro cycle, depending on what that term means to you. Oh God. But those, you can have an emphasis on those. It's a matter of degrees, right? So certain parts of the season, or if I feel an athlete is lacking in that area, I may amp up the max strength in one PDSF. I may add an extra exercise in. I may experiment with different loading schemes to get whatever effect I want, but I'm not going to do it to the exclusion of the specific work, right? Because to me, I just never want to get away from that specific work too much unless I feel there's a need for it. Okay. So as great as the Verkhoshansky block system seems, and it can work, and sometimes you have no choice. Okay. There are sports where you have no choice in that. If you're, and I use this as an example in the course. I mean, if you're a ski jumper and you spend most of your season away from a ski hill, or most of your life away from, and you're only being brought into a camp in the winter for 2 months, well, then the block system may work very well for you. I mean, it's not a matter of, is it a bad system or is it a good system? But the way I look at it is, if you can do specific work all around, and you should try to be able to do that. You should try to create an environment where you can do specific work all the time. Then you need to do it, because that's the fastest way to development. There's no doubt. I mean, if you go and you talk to any world-class sprint coach, and they will tell you that the idea of not sprinting for 3 to 4 month blocks, they're just not going to do it. They're just, regardless of what, you may gain big strength gains, but with, and then there may be a delayed onset. It's just not worth it. It's just not, it just doesn't, there's a better way, and it's using this complex method if you can. So it's not a matter, again, it's not black and white. It's not like use a complex or don't use a complex. It's try to take that principle that is behind sort of a complex methodology and move as close to it as you can within the realities that is whatever your reality is for your sport.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. that makes good sense too, with like the ski hill jumper. Yeah, those sports where if you can't be in your sport the whole time, but if you can, which, I mean, throwing is pretty simple and straightforward. Well, I mean, I guess some people might not have access to a throwing field or something like that at particular points, but yeah, if you can't do it, it totally would make sense. But yeah, in the sprinting example, yeah, like if you just did strength work for 3 months or 4 months, and by the time you actually got running, your coordination and your muscle balance would be such a different place. Like the sprint technique would probably be off at that point. It would take you a while just to get it back and be in harmony and synchronicity. So it definitely it makes me think too. You were talking about where if you do need to add or bring a strength level up, like a javelin thrower needs to get stronger, it makes, like, I would imagine that strength cycle that where you're like, okay, we're going to put more strength in, you would still expect for their javelin to be better at the end of that cycle, not worse, like at the expense of strength. Yep. Like you would expect for that strength to make a positive impact right off the bat.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I'm coaching a guy right now, long distance, John Krakowski, who was our national champion last year, but he's kind of been tapering off the last few years. So I've been working with him this year, and it's exactly what we were in, exactly that situation. We needed to increase his left side block more. So we put some exercises in that in the first PDSF, I think it worked well. He's throwing quite well in workout right now. And, but we didn't give up the javelin, right? I mean, it all comes down to the nuances of exercise prescription, okay, and loading. And it's not about abandoning doing all forms of specific work and then slamming them with strength. That's what you want to kind of get away from, right? And the reality is too, is there's, different roads lead to Rome, right? So is that the saying? Anyway, there are coaches out there that are big weight room guys. From what I hear, big weight room guys are hugely successful. So you look at like John Smith, the guy in Mississippi, I mean, he has a fantastically successful program. And I'm not, he's more successful than I, with his throwers, and he's he's a big strength guy. And although I will say this though, I think sometimes, you hear stories about people and it gets misleading. I'll bet you if you go in and you look at even that guy's program, it's very specific all year round. And again, there may be big strength block emphasis, which is, you're coaching shot putters, you need to do that. But I'll bet you he probably does less pure absolute maximal strength than we actually think. And he's probably moving the bar. They're probably have an emphasis on speed in their lifting, and they just get grotesquely strong off of that. And he's, and that's what you do as a throws coach. That's what you got to do. So, I've learned you have to be careful with making assumptions for the rumors you hear about people and their programs and stuff like that. I mean, but I guarantee you, again, using him as an example, if you went in like Nick Garcia did, you travel there and you hang out with a guy for a couple of weeks, you'll, if you really look at it, he's doing the same as every world-class throws coach is doing. But there may be shifts here, depending on what week you show up to see what he's doing. There may be shifts here and there, but essentially he knows how to get an athlete to a world-class level and to the podium, and it's just a different, he's probably, his program is probably a reflection of his environment and the athlete he works with, just like any other smart coach.
Yeah, I
hope that makes sense.
No, it definitely does. And I imagine like the generalities too. Like even when these athletes are doing these maximal strength blocks, so to speak, I'm sure it's not to the point where like that is such a huge portion of the program they're just like not throwing it, or their throws are going down because they're doing it too much. Like I'm sure it's their throws are probably going up at that point. It's probably done in balance and with amount of balance and harmony to it, and not.
Yeah, well, it's all about the nuance, right? It's all about, and hey, in the Bondarchuk system, in 2 of the 3 reactions, athletes go down. Athletes go down before they come up, and it's a bad down sometimes, man. If you show up to workout that day, they're throwing. John in his last cycle had a 10-meter spread between his worst throw in the cycle and his best throw.
Wow,
that's huge. So yeah, I mean, it's not all about keeping athletes at the super high level all the time, but it's you have to be careful how the assumptions you make when you hear things, but it's like you need to look at the reality, the facts.
Yeah, to me, those spreads that takes a lot of faith. Like for me, I know I start to get in a really bad mood if I'm in a training cycle myself, or in times past, and my performance would start to crater. Like I know I wasn't on the system or anything like that, but I mean, I know athletes. I mean, what's it like with athletes and trying to keep them steered towards the goal mentally, or keeping them dialed in mentally if they're in that big of a spread? Is that a challenge in the system?
It is when it's the first time you're working with them. So again, one of the biggest sections in this course is dealing with this, right? That I'm doing is the peculiarities of sport form in the Bondarchuk system, where 2 of the 3 reactions involve a dip in performance before the athlete starts to adapt and the results start to climb. When you are doing this system with a new athlete, it requires a leap of faith on their part, and because they haven't experienced it. So think about it. They take on a new coach, and John is fantastic to work with. He's one of the best athletes I've ever worked with in terms of just being able to interact with, and he's so on the ball. It's just been a real pleasure to coach him. But, think about it. You start with this new coach, you're doing this system you really, don't know anything about, and all of a sudden in the first 2 weeks, your results go down 5 meters. You're like, oh, like, what did I do, right? And, but, so with a new athlete, it requires, it requires some education and communication. So I say, look, you need to prepare yourself for this, because this is what could happen. And he was fine with it, right? I sent him some examples of other athletes I've coached, And remember, we're not changing anything. So the natural reaction for all coaches in the world is that when something starts going down, you need to change things to bring it back up, and we don't do that. We just wait it out till it comes back up. But when it's an athlete that you've worked with for a while and they've gone through that process, it's easy because they just accept it. They know that could be one of their paths to adaptation. And if you need to, like I used to do with a number of my athletes, particularly going into big events, is I pull out the past data and I say, look, that you peak in X amount of sessions, and between session X and X, you're down, and that's where we are, and it's coming, and it always comes back up. So, I rely on the data. The only time you ever have to address it is when you have a new athlete.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, that's where the reactions are fascinating to me as well. Have you, like, some athletes who can go up right away, some who go down right away, some who are in the middle. Have you noticed any kind of just general trends, whether it be psychological, physical, with an athlete who if you get a new athlete, is there any times you can even kind of predict their reaction is going to be like?
No. The only way to do that, Okay. Again, go through this extensive. There's a lot to this, and I've said this before in other interviews and presentations, is that one of the probably the most difficult part of the Bondarchuk system to get my head around, and the last part which I figured out, was the rest cycles, because that has a huge impact on things. And even doing this course, I would, I've done this for years, and I think I've got it pretty much figured out. But even with the reactions from whether you put a rest cycle in or don't put a rest cycle in, Dr. B threw me a curveball a couple weeks ago about it. And he's always experimenting and changing his ideas. So, but basically it comes down to this, those three reactions are inherent in a lot of athletes, but they also will change. They will definitely change depending upon how you structure your how you periodize your development cycles, your PDSFs, what we call period of development of sport form, PDSF. Number one, start off at a lower level, 90 to 85% of form, which is basically completely out of shape. Number two, start off somewhere between 95 and 92%. Number three, start off 95, 96, maybe 90, at a higher level. Okay. So that's, we sort all that out in the, that's a long discussion how those, so the amount of detraining that happens before you start the cycle has an impact on whether on which of the reactions that you're going to be. So you might be able to predict it that way. And there's, like I said, there's a few curveballs I talk about in the course, which are pretty essential to know regardless of who you're training. The big thing is this. I mean, if the big message, if you're not doing Bondarchuk, one of the big messages that I try to get across to people is you have to appreciate the impact that variation and change has on how an athlete reacts to training across the board. Okay. Doesn't matter what your system is. Okay. The only difference when you boil it right down, the only difference between the Bondarchuk system and any other system is we really manage that change. I mean, really manage it. We use a change of exercise set as the primary driver of adaptation, as opposed to wave loading, all the, volumes and intensities. Right. And in doing that, having done that for 10 years now, I've learned that, you have to be careful how much you change, because just random chaotic change can throw the athlete in all kinds of, their reaction can go in all kinds of different directions. Maybe a good direction, but sometimes you're taking a chance. They can, so if you want to manage that and peak properly, you have to control it. So.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Derek, I want to take it, before I forget, I want to take it back to something you were talking about earlier with kind of deciding to put in more of a max strength emphasis in each PDSF or developmental cycle. And this is something I've been thinking about, really for a few years, but there was a study that came out. It was like, again, I don't think the subjects were highly trained. They had some training, but it was like, they found that they had these athletes doing periods of 10-week training blocks, and the first block was 80% 100 max, and the second was 60, and some athletes had better rate of force development adaptation to the 80, and some had better to the 60, so it was like you have these strength or speed responders. And I was wondering, do you kind of have athletes that tend to go like light to heavy in that sort of emphasis throughout the course of the year, or heavy to light, or is it really just one cycle to the next, deciding after each cycle which the next direction you'll go in terms of a strength emphasis? How do you kind of manage that throughout each year in the developmental cycles?
Well, again, it goes back to the long-term implementation of this thing, from PDSF to PDSF, block of micros, from one peak condition to another. Okay. There can be emphasis, but they're subtle. Okay. They're subtle. Basically, I'm always in each one. This is another sort of big difference here is that I'm just trying to get an athlete as much growth within each one of those PDSFs as possible. This is something that Bondarchuk probably doesn't do. I haven't really seen any anecdotal evidence of him doing it, but I may go in the off season a bit higher up in the rep scheme, but I'd never go outside of developing true speed and power. I don't need to, I mean, there's no point in me doing it unless I feel like we've been so long within, say, 2 to 6 reps years. I may go up to 8 reps for a cycle, just, that kind of thing, like maybe go more into the hypertrophy range or something, but only if I feel we've exhausted all other possibilities and we just need a change up. I wouldn't do it leading into competition or anything like that. But generally speaking, no, I stay within the highly specific boundaries needed, and I just change the exercise set. Again, that's the driving thing in the Bondarchuk system. Sorry, what was your where was that question going again?
Oh, no worries. Yeah, like just kind of the idea of maybe more the general idea too of like coaches with like who have a light to heavy mentality throughout the year, or heavy to light. I think heavy to light's always the common one, right? Like,
oh yes,
like we're gonna start heavy,
so I mean, it's it's really, yes, you can, but again, I would rather keep things more specific as possible all the time. And rather than, and Bondarchuk would call that wave loading volume and intensity. You're just wave loading it over the long term. We don't really do that. I keep it, consistent. I keep it within those very specific parameters, and we just change the exercises. Okay. So the loading is very, it's very close to what the specific needs of whatever the competitive event is. So if you're a sprinter, that's going to be, maximal power and speed and power in the weight room. I'm going to, other than GPE, which is different, right? That's the one classification at the bottom, but I'm not using GPE to drive specific form. I'm using GPE to maintain general abilities and promote recovery from session to session. So,
yeah, sure thing. Oh no, that's a great answer. And it actually leads me to just like, so the final, like say the championship cycle. Can you talk a little bit about the information you use from the early cycles to kind of put the best exercises for the athlete in that last like training block, and how to, I mean, I've heard like, you want to like save the ones that give the best reaction till like the end or the Olympic year or things like that. Could you give a couple like kind of nuts and bolts or a few examples of how you might build up that last block for now? Because I think that's kind of what a lot of it comes down to in terms of the generalities of that question is, how do I get that athlete ready for that final block before their biggest competition?
Okay, so now we're talking about transfer training, okay? And if I forget to answer your question, so I'm going to back up a bit.
That's okay.
It's 8:00 in the morning, and my kids have me up early. Okay, so I've gotten away from annual plans now. Okay, so I don't do annual plans anymore because it's just the only reason I would ever do it. I know where I want to be at specific times of the year, but the only reason I ever do it is if there's an administrative requirement, someone needs it for funding, and then I be quite honestly, I bullshit it and I send them what they want to see. They don't look at it anyways. They never do. And even if they do look at it, they don't know how to decipher it. So, and I get people, it's ridiculous. I get people all over, email, hey man, hey, can you send me a plan? I gotta, and so they just fill in the name, change something, send it. It's stupid. But I think there's for young coaches and developing coaches, and I think we all need to have something on paper that tells us what our long-term strategy is. Just as I've used the Bondarchuk system, I've learned that it's just I just don't need to. Now I am looking ahead. I'm looking ahead 2 to 3 PDSFs. I'm probably looking ahead a good 2 to 3 months, especially as we get up to the competitive season. Okay. So I needed to step back and say that for a second. So what I'm doing is throughout the year, as I'm bringing an athlete into these peaks in these PDSFs, which typically are about 6 to 8 weeks long with most throwers. Okay. Again, it all comes down to how often can you do the specific work. If you can't sprint 10 times a week. I don't care what anybody says. You can't throw javelin 10 times a week. So those cycles are going to be a little different. They're going to be, so those peaks are going to be a little longer. Okay. But let's say in heavy throws, we can peak in, 4 to 6 weeks sometimes. Okay. So that means I'm probably going to have 5, 6, maybe 7 peaks throughout the year as I'm going along. So I start in, we start in the off season, September, October, and the athlete comes to peak. Then we do whatever we're going to do, rest or not rest. We do another PDSF. They come in. As I start to collect data from each of those PDSFs, I'm looking and I'm keeping an eye on in the cycles where we had good growth, like the curves, there's a big peak and overall growth. So the athlete got better, PBs or whatever. What did we do in those cycles? And what did we do? And, what I'm trying to decipher what led to that peak. I'm looking at even the cycle before, because yes, there is such a thing as delayed onset, I think, there's direct transfer, indirect transfer. I mean, it's not easy. You never really figure it out, but you look at trends, and I've used this example all the time. So as we're going through the year, I'm keeping detailed results, training data. As we get a few cycles out from a main competition, so let's say our main competition is in late August, and the athlete is typically taking 4 to 6 weeks to reach peak condition. So 15 weeks out, so way early in the spring, I'm starting to think about this like right now. And we're doing this podcast, it's May 11th, right? So I'm starting to keep an eye on these things. And because in that PDSF right before the major champs, I'm going to want the most growth. If in fact the periodization works out that way, right? I mean, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you have a million competitions before and there'll be a maintenance period or whatever. But regardless, as I'm going into that last championship PDSF, I'm going to want that PDSF to be that's got to be the best cycle I've ever written. It's got to be the most effective cycle with the most transfer I've ever written. So as I'm going through the year, I'm going to pick and choose the exercises that I've introduced, and the weight of javelins, the weight room exercises, the special exercises, and I'm going to make sure those are in the last one. That's pretty obvious, right? That's common sense, right? The problem is, what throws a wrench into the whole thing is that no matter how good the exercise is at stimulating adaptation, they adapt to it. And so over the long term, you cannot keep going back to the same exercises because they just won't improve. And this is why when I talk to particularly speed power coaches, S&C people, whoever they are, I say to them, if you want to do the Bondarchuk system, you don't have to give up your favorite modalities. You just have to understand that you can't do them all the time. And when you look at these guys that are really stuck, for a while, you see it all the time. There's some kind of new system that's out there. There's some kind of new rep scheme, or there's some form of strength management that works really well for a time. And then after a while, then they move on to another one. Well, why did you move on to the new one? Are you telling me that the old one doesn't work anymore? They all work. As long as they're reasonable and they're sane in their implementation and approach, all these different rep schemes and strategies, they all work, but none of them, I don't care how good it is, never ever works forever. So you have to you have to understand that and appreciate that and be able to rotate and bring exercises and in and out so that when you go into that last PDSF or that last development cycle before the main comp, they haven't done it for a while, because if they've been doing it all summer, it's not going to work. And we see this all the time. And that's a big reason why championship performance drops off for people, because again, it's natural to us when something works, keep doing it. Don't change what's not broken, right? Yes, that's true, but you also have to appreciate the reality that if you keep doing the same thing, they're going to drop off. Our sport is famous for it, because we see this, athletes will do single periodization or double periodization throughout the year. First period leads to a huge growth. They come out in April, massive performances, and then then we don't see those performances again, or they don't improve again. This is one of the reasons why, because naturally when, they came out and competed and the athlete had a huge result, the coach is like, whoa, geez, what we did was awesome. Let's keep doing it. So they keep doing it, and the athlete plateaus, right? Or worse, drops off. So it's constantly monitoring this, finding the right exercises. You just cannot keep introducing the same set of exercises. And that's, and oh my God, we go through this so much in the course. I mean, and I wish I could give you a nice packaged response to it, but a package, like Bondarchuk has these books out about throwing programs. They're only meant as examples. I mean, you can't keep doing the same canned stuff all the time. So it's about managing that, and and then it gets even more of a brain fuck in that it's not just about the exercises. It's also about, in the long term, the system. So, and again, we sort of talked about this at the beginning, we're talking about athletes coming from big max strength systems, and then doing the Bondarchuk system and having good growth early on. That's simply its system change, right? So you have this need for change on all these different levels: the exercise, the loading schemes, the weekly periodization, the medium-term periodization, and the long-term periodization, the structure of the workouts. So famously, in the Bondarchuk system is this parts program that we talk about all the time, where you go from doing everything in a serial fashion, to changing it in a cycle, to doing things in a parts where an athlete will throw, then go in the weight room, then come back out and throw, and and then do more weight, go back in the weight room, and if you can do that, and these are ways to stimulate that adaptation by introducing new stimuluses on all these different levels and in all these different areas.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, that's there's so much good stuff in there. I'm trying to unpack it a little bit. I have a few questions to follow up with that, and I mean that's it right there. Like one of the things as you were talking that kind of comes up in my mind is every coach, even outside the Bondarchuk system, like intuitively knows that they can't just write the same program year after year. But I think what we tend to miss is like exactly why we are changing the exercises and structure. And keeping better track of who responds to what, and being able to manage responding to different exercises. I really like the podcast you did with Martin. I think it was maybe a couple of years ago, but how athletes often will change from one coach to another and then set a personal best. And because they just needed variation so badly, and they had adapted so quickly to the system. And I think especially probably those athletes who are the faster responders in the cycle probably even have more to suffer than others, like if they are just in a typical system where things don't change as often as they should.
The better the athlete, the higher the level of the athlete, the more trainability they have, the more important this is. Okay? So, you can take a developing athlete and, it almost doesn't matter what you do. I'm being very loose with my words there, and they will grow. okay, because their trainability is so freaking high that, but as athletes, I think I might have misspoke a second, but as athletes' trainability gets smaller and smaller, as they get more and more elite, this becomes more and more difficult, right? Like you need to be really on top of it. And the more sensitive their nervous system is, especially in speed power events, they just adapt so fast, right? The better athletes come into form really, really quickly. And for the most part. And, so you have to be able to react to it. That's why, what they call recipe programs, it's fine to do that at a lower levels, but as you get to higher levels and more elite, that's not, it just doesn't, it works, but it only works so long, and then it stops working.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And just on maybe a very general level, so it becomes, obviously you have to really tighten the screws on how you're monitoring that athlete the better they get and how they're adapting. Is there any, I suppose it's a difficult question, but generally speaking, athletes who are more advanced, their cycle length will generally become shorter and shorter over time? Or till they adapt? Will they adapt faster?
Yes.
Yes,
but I think that's more of an adaptation to the overall system. Okay. So if, like most of the athletes I've worked with over 3 to 4 years, you take Mark and Sophie. I don't have a lot of examples because I don't have a lot. I've moved around so much, from Kamloops to Edmonton to Britain and back to Kamloops, and that I don't have a lot of experience with athletes over like 6, 8, 10 years sort of thing. But the ones, so I had Mark and Sophie and a couple other. I had Mark and Sophie in Britain for 3.5 years, right? And I noticed with both of them, as they, their time to peak condition got shorter and shorter over the course of those 3 years. To me, that is a reflection of them adapting to the system overall and becoming a better athlete, right? The higher the level, they got better and better and better. And as they got better, their time to their response to the system became shorter and shorter. So, yeah. And so, and then when I coached Sultana here, who'd been in the Bondarchuk system for years before, I mean, her response to training is very fast. Like she's in shape in she reaches a peak condition in about 3 to 4 weeks. It's crazy. Like, very short. So.
Yeah. Wow. And outside the system, I imagine it's a lot. I'm sure coaches can still do it. Like coaches with great intuition still do that, but it's probably a little bit harder than when you're able to track an athlete's reaction very precisely over time. I mean, you don't need to do Bondarchuk to track athletes, to monitor an athlete and be able to analyze data. That's nothing new to Bondarchuk. I mean, Bondarchuk doesn't even really track it on a computer the way I do and look at graphs. As far as I know, he just sort of writes results down and keeps it in his head. But what's unique is that we control so much that wave loading and volume and intensity. It's easier to sort of weed out what the effects are, negative and positive, in terms of what leads to growth, because we're controlling something that in most other systems, most other types of training, is wildly changing every day. And that's fine. If you've done that, if you have a system where you understand what that you need, if you have a pattern of that change that will consistently lead to adaptation, all the power to you. I'm just saying that in ours, that's not how we do it. And when we do implement this system, we see things. I've seen things I never saw before. And so I'm not, so it just, it's important to control those variables, whatever those variables are, however you're controlling them. Just make sure that, the more random and chaotic changing you have in your system, the harder it is to determine what it was that led to growth. Oh, right on. That what you just said there, I think is so. I'm trying to learn that more and more each year. That last bit what you just said, just to make it a little bit easier to kind of feed my intuition with what it needs to know. I know our time's getting close here. I had two kind of hopefully be quick questions for you. One I was thinking about as you were mentioning, and I know within the Bondarchuk system, this is back to weight training a little bit, but like the weight training, you're not, the 1RM or the percentage you're working with stays the same throughout the cycle. And you've talked about VBT in the past. But do you think that if you were taking the system outside to train sprinters or basketball players or another sport, the value in keeping the weight the same across the cycle rather than trying to increase it throughout the cycle? What do you think? Do you think that's valuable outside that Bondarchuk system?
Yes, I do, because I think that, the more consistent it is, the easier it is to determine how they peak and when they peak. It's a lot easier now with bar velocities. Like that's really really helped out a lot. Like, so I think, especially for SNC speed power people, coaches that are working in environments where they cannot control the CE and the SDE, particularly the CE. So in other words, you're working with like an NBA basketball player and you have zero control over their basketball playing, but you're responsible for everything else. Then I think that system can really help because you can control and learn. They have so much change, variation going on. Maybe I'm speaking outside of my area of expertise here, but I'm going to assume that, there's in the CE with the way practice is and just the nature of the sport in basketball is that, they're not doing the exact same thing every day. Right. So it's really, if your job is to get them powerful and stronger and a better athlete, creating sort of that speed power base to become a better athlete, the more that you can actually control that, the better. And the more random change you have in there, the harder that is to do. So yes, I do think it will help. And again, the beauty with the bar velocities is now you have a way to measure that, right? So I'll give you an example. So I started working with this John a couple cycles ago, and he is in an environment where he's in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, and he can't throw outside. He wasn't able to throw outside the first PDSF we did, and so he's thrown into a net. So I can't measure. I can't measure the CE. I can't measure distance thrown. So we use bar velocities. And so but we kept the weight the same, and we're doing the same program, the same format of program that we would normally do. All we're not doing is actually measuring the jab because it's hitting a net, right? So we can't measure it. So I'm measuring a snatch pull and a single leg squat or something like that. We found when you set the weight, set the workout, and over the course of 6 weeks, he produced curves in those bar velocities just like he would in throwing distance. Then we took a rest, and then we started a new PDSF. And all of this I use in the course. I use this exact examples in the course. And we found that in the second PDSF, lo and behold, the patterns in the with different exercises in the bar velocities peaked around the same, about 11 to 12, 10. I think in the first one he peaked at 11 exposures, and in the second one it was 9 or 10. And the throws now in the second PDSF, we were able to throw outside and measure, and now his peaks in those were basically mimic those of the bar velocities. Okay, so yeah, it's important to, having that additional data really, really helps. And, the more you can control it, the more you can make inferences on how the athlete adapts.
Yeah, I think that's something that's awesome to think about and keep in all of our minds, regardless of whether we're throws coaches or just physical preparation coaches, and being able to simplify how we look at our adaptations. And the VBT too at least keeps it motivating too for the athlete. I think where an athlete might be demotivated by, it's the same weight, at least they can be like,
VBT, okay. You mean velocity bar training?
Oh, yeah, the velocity, the bar monitoring, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they're more motivated probably to, every day, even if the bar is the same and they're not used to it. They're like, oh, okay, at least I can. I have a lot of athletes I think would, at least at first, probably struggle with that, but with a velocity, it'd be like, it's kind of like a throw. It's like, how far did I throw this? How fast did the bar go? That tend to.
Yeah, you know what? I find they actually like it. They actually, like the feedback from athletes I put on a John, it's like once you get the initial the program set and the workouts going, and you're just repeating the same workout, or in his case, it was 3 different workouts. He doesn't have to think, right? So his job is just to come in every day and pull a shit out of that bar as fast as he can, right? He doesn't have to, he kind of likes it. And it allows them, especially in the technical work, to really focus in on what needs to be done. Like all their mental energy goes into the technique, and expressing force in whatever way that is. So, whether it's pulling the bar faster or throwing the javelin harder or whatever, or there's just less things to think about, and so they can focus in on that, and it works quite well.
Yeah, that's where
the feedback I get from the athletes is always really good on that.
Yeah, that's where it's at. That fits a lot in with I just did a Dan John podcast a few weeks ago, and that's like one of his big things is the more like willpower you're expending on all these things in the program, the less you can really adapt to what matters. And willpower is a thing. Yeah,
that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's exactly what I'm talking. It's where's your mental energy, right? Because it can't, and if every time the athlete goes in there, and okay, what am I doing today? Oh yeah, all right, I got to do that. Oh God, I got to go find this, and I got to, oh shit, oh I got to go to this weight room because it has whatever, on this day I need, it's just distracting, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to do it, but it's.
Yeah, it's an awesome way to simplify. I love it. Well, hey, Derek, I'd ask you this last question, but I feel like it would take us 20 more minutes. So maybe we can get it some other podcast or something like that. But
we'll ask it, and if it's long, you can cut it out.
Oh, okay.
I'll keep the answer short.
All right, awesome. Well, all right, yeah, I'm excited to ask you this one actually. All right, so yeah, last question. You had mentioned this with the parts system before a little bit, and like weight room, throwing weight room. And speaking of Dan John too, I was reading his contrarian approach to discus throwing. He was talking about using special strength to teach the skill, like working with tires and cones to teach the discus. And how I was going to ask you in terms of the Bondarchuk system, like mixing like you had talked about mixing the order, like the SD and the CE. Is there a time where, when you were saying lifting before you throw, would that be like earlier in the day, or you lift and then you go out and throw right afterwards? I think Lauren Seagrave did talk a little bit too about, like, was it Dwight Phillips had peaked out doing the typical order, speed, plyos, weight room, and then so he switched it up and he was improved right off the bat doing that and talking about variety. But maybe, and trying to keep this quick too, but just talking a little bit about, is that really what I want to know is that like right, like one on top of the other time wise, or is that spread out throughout the day, or just some quick thoughts on that?
Well, it can be either, but the way we do it is we will, we'll drag the weights out to the circle, so they can step right out of the circle and do, if it's a clean, do a clean and relax, or when I was coaching the girls up in Pinitan, I had my throwing farm up there. They just jump on the quad, ride the quad up to the weight room, do a few sets, and come back down and throw again. It's done right there. The whole thing. It's literally you take 4 or 5 throws and run up to the weight room, do a few sets, do whatever's prescribed, come back down. It's all done right there. It doesn't have to be that way. You can change it up any way you want. It's the thing that's important, and I think this was in your example with Lauren, is that it's not about really so much about the specifics of what you're doing. It's the actual change that is what's important. So that's the way I would answer that. I mean, but we do it, I'm always trying to find ways to change things up so that there's, we're not doing the same thing, because they adapt to everything. And that's what a lot of coaches don't understand. And what I didn't understand is I started doing the Bondarchuk system. They adapt to the exercises. They adapt to the reps. the loading schemes. They adapt to the structure of workout. We're not the first people to say this. You want to turn things around, change the order of things in workout. It may be just enough to create, even with the same exercise, it might just be enough to stimulate adaptation. You have to get creative with it, but not be nuts, right? Not be insane, and not cause, not do things that are going to get people hurt.
Oh yeah. No, that's an awesome answer. It actually fits with like a lot of stuff I've been thinking about lately. And I remember when I first started work as a full-time college strength coach, one of the track coaches had said like, oh yeah, we used to do like deadlifts right before our block starts. And I'm thinking, okay, is that good? Is bad? Potentiation? But it's like, yeah, it's just a subtle change. Like, did it create a change? Like, was it just enough to, it's not like, is this the ultimate thing you should do all the time? But I mean, it's so, what you said there fits really well within that. And even in my own personal workouts, just for even fitness, I just wanted to do something different. So I went out the track and did some kettlebell swings and sprinted right after. And I felt really good the day after. Like I was jumping out of the gym, and it was just like my body just needed something different. It wasn't that I should do this workout all the time. Like, but for a few weeks, it feels awesome. So that's great stuff. And
all we do is control that. All we do is control and monitor it. Simple.
Yeah.
Within a set of rules.
I love it. All right. Well, hey, great stuff today, Derek. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And
no problem. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, it's always good talking to you. And I definitely, I love going down the training rabbit holes and training structure, as well as when to simplify training structure and helping to bring things back to this like manageable set of ideas that you can really use to get athletes better. So I really appreciate it, man.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here today with us. Glad to have you as a listener. If you enjoyed what you heard, you have the time. The best way you can help us out is to review the podcast, share it with those who you think might benefit from learning a little bit more about how to really deliver and fine-tune adaptations through the Bondarchuk training principles. We'll be back next week with another great guest. It was awesome to have Derek on today. Also, please don't forget, visit our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology. We'll see you guys next week.